to just thank everyone for coming here and for hearing my reading. Also, it's really great to see you here, and I'd really like to say a big thank you to Maureen and John and Helen and Rachel, and also especially to Erica as well for providing the refreshments. I really hope you all enjoy my reading, and I'm going to pass you on to Sophia.
Hi, I'm Sophia Blackwell. I'm originally a performance poet, so I'm going to be doing some poetry for you. I think Eleanor and anyone else doing some poetry on FY radio ages ago. It's very flattering that you remember me. And I'm also going to be doing an extract from my first novel, After My Own Heart, which came out almost a year ago in March 2012. An extract or two, depending on how much time has passed. So, yeah, thank you all very much for coming and enjoying it.
I'm Kaveney. I'm a fantasy novelist, poet and critic. I've got a couple of poetry collections out, and volume 1 of a big fantasy novel, a fantasy trilogy or quartet. Volume 2 will be out later this year, and I'll be reading mostly from the novel, but I'll probably inflict a couple of pens on as well.
This is my prologue to my novel. It's called The Strange Child, and I set it in the witch trials in Salem in 1692. It's in a fictional village, and it introduces, I think, the theme of sexuality and also the theme of vampirism, which are the two main themes of my novel. I hope you can all hear me. If you want me to speak louder, please say. Prologue, The Strange Child. Hartnell Village, Massachusetts, New England, 1692. This is what she told herself when the strange child first came to her. Something quiet and good inside of you has shattered. What you see before you is a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and lack of food. It is a symptom of the madness which they say is natural in you. But the madness was to come later. Much later. It was the strange child who slunk out of her cell's shadows that night. Tiny in size, with a face as pale as the white cloth cap that covered her hair, thick strokes for eyebrows and beetle black eyes. She glided across the dirty, straw-covered floor, neatly dodging the rats that skittered in the filth. Angelica, she said tentatively. Angelica noticed how she lingered over the syllables of her name, as if savouring their sound. The child's eyes darted up and down her, taking in the chair to which she had been bound, the bloodstains on her dress, and her waxen, drawn face. Of course, there was no mirror in the cell, but even Angelica knew what she must have looked like. The spirited, brown-eyed and strong-limbed girl she had been was now a thing of the past. She smelled, her clothes were rancid with sweat, and she was limp from lack of sleep, barely on the edge of consciousness. Every time she had tried, desperately, to drift off to sleep, the guard had smacked her awake until her lip had split. Now he sat on a stool opposite her, watching her every move, with piggish eyes that were shielded underneath his heavy, protruding brow. How long had she been kept incarcerated? 2 days? 3 days? Perhaps even more? Time spooled out into a ribbon that grew tighter and tighter as the night of her execution approached. A beggar was to have looked more dignified than her, and yet this strange, waif-like child looked at her as if she were the most alluring creature on earth. Angelica, the child said again, this time with a little more confidence, I can help you. But Angelica thought of her mother and sister, taken from her only days before, and knew she was past all salvation. Trust me, I can help you, the child repeated, sliding closer. Her nostrils quivered as she sniffed the air appreciatively. You smell like rosemary, she murmured. No, I smell like piss, Angelica replied. The child must be insane, she thought. Was it that she could smell the sprig of rosemary secretly sewn into the hem of her dress? No, impossible. The stench of death and decay has cloaked every inch of me. But the child laughed, baring her teeth, which was small and strikingly white in darkness. "You are willful," she giggled. Angelica could tell that she meant it as a compliment and not as an admonishment, unlike the other villagers. But then she saw how her eyes glittered in the darkness, and she grew suddenly afraid. "You are the devil," she cried hoarsely, staring into her luminous, almost cat-like eyes. Her throat was raw from lack of water, and the words came out harsh. The child pouted. "Do I look like the devil?" "The devil has many illusions," Angelica said, taking a moment to cast a wary look at the guard, who did not appear to see her visitor. This only confirmed her suspicions. Perhaps the village folk were right after all, and her wicked desires had been made manifest in the form of a demon that had come to torment her in her last living hours. "You are not real," she said firmly. The walls of Angelica's cell had widened and contracted as the little one's face swam before her eyes. "If I were not real, could I do this?" As quick as a fox, the child bent over and kissed Angelica's throat, soft at first, and then more insistently, nudging over her bloodied lip. Angelica flinched initially at the pressure of her mouth, at the bump of her jaw, but then relaxed when she realized that the child wasn't going to harm her. "I will not harm you," the child said, drawing away from her as though she could read her thoughts. "Let me save you." She lifted her head from Angelica's neck, and Angelica noticed that a drop of her own scarlet blood had spotted the child's lips. The child smiled bashfully and licked her lips, but didn't lower her gaze. "Please, let me," she said again. There was something calming about her words, her cool voice, her steady, unwavering gaze, but Angelica tried to resist it. "How?" she demanded. "How can you save me when my mother and sister are both dead, when they were both drowned and dumped in a shallow grave?" She stumbled over the last words, loath to say them out loud, to accept that it had really happened. What she didn't say, however, was how she had stolen away under the cover of night and dug their bodies up herself. That she had dragged her mother's corpse back home, stumbling as her feet slipped in the mud and a sweat collected in the hollow of her back. That she had carried her little sister's broken doll body in her arms, cradling her cold neck in the warmth of her elbow, feeling the familiar softness of her red hair for the last time. Exhausted, empty, and trained, she had buried them as tenderly as she could underneath the apple tree in their garden. She had watered the earth with her tears. "They were drowned at daybreak. I could not help them then," the little girl replied, her voice heavy with regret. Something bright flashed in the gloom, and Angelica noticed that the child wore a sapphire as large as her own knuckle on a gold chain around her neck. Where did she get such a gem? It looked odd next to the stiff, plain fabric of her Puritan dress. She followed the direction of Angelica's eyes and promptly stuffed the brilliant blue rock under her collar. "Let me tell you of my plan," the child said briskly, and proceeded to explain how this would be her only chance to save Angelica's life, but that, if she gave her permission, she could never go back to the village or her old life again. She would have to begin a new, very different life, and it would be one in which all sense of time would be rendered meaningless. But, she insisted, no one would ever try to hunt her again, and no one would ever be able to harm her. Angelica tried to listen carefully, even though her head pounded and dryness gnawed at her throat, but some of the words still got lost. All she knew was that anything seemed better than becoming another victim of the witch hunters that had wormed their way into her home, corroding everything and everyone they came into contact with. Angelica wanted to escape from the pen of Hartnell village and go somewhere far, far away, where she could live without fear of persecution or judgment, somewhere where she could laugh and smile and wear clothes that didn't feel and look like despair. She found herself wondering what it would be like to wear red. To her, red was the colour of desire, of hearts and kisses and thick petalled roses in full bloom. It was as far apart from the dry, gristle colour of her own clothes as she could imagine, and the idea that she would never get to experience something so trivial broke her heart. And so Angelica had nodded, just the once. She hadn't known that giving her consent would change her forever and irrevocably, or that it would tip the scales of both light and dark within her, sending her spiralling towards madness. It never occurred to her that red was also the colour of blood. At her nod, the child moved so quickly she seemed to shimmer against the darkness of the cell. She tilted Angelica's throat, and before she had even a chance to cry out, a sharp, aching pain raced through her neck as if a bee had stung her. Her very bones burned, only to be followed by a pain so cold it racked her with shivers from head to foot. All the muscles and sinews in her body felt as though they had been furred over with ice crystals. She opened her mouth to scream, but a little hand was immediately clamped over her mouth, muffling her cries. And still the dreaming, dazed guard saw or heard nothing. In fact, he appeared to be sound asleep, even though just a little while before he had been watching her intently, even avidly. Now his eyes were closed, and his head had slumped onto his chest. A snail trail of drool had leaked onto his chin. His chest rose and fell as he breathed rhythmically. The child brought her own wrist to her mouth and bit deep, holding it to Angelica's lips. She gazed down, barely comprehending through a haze of pain, and saw that the blood that dripped from its small wrist was tar black. "You must drink," the child whispered. Her stomach tightened at the words, but Angelica obeyed, and she was surprised to find that the blood that filled her mouth didn't taste of the metallic tang of human blood at all. Instead, it tasted wondrous and sweet, like raspberries picked from hedgerows and chestnuts roasted over her kitchen fire when the year had begun to wane. It felt as warm and golden as sunlight and slid down her throat as easily and naturally as water, but it didn't quench her thirst. A feral, whining voice inside her urged for more. She gulped from the child's wrist until she felt her try to tug her arm away. Eventually, the child made an odd, growling sound, and with unnatural strength wrenched her head up, away from the glossy black blood that was pooling in her lap. Angelica opened her eyes and realized that she must have fainted. Now the moonlight was already beginning to thin, and she was being led, barefoot, towards the pond, with two village men marching behind her, their heavy boots trampling weeds and wildflowers alike. The squat priest trotted ahead in front of her, mumbling a prayer for her soul she didn't hear. Rope used to bind her hands together behind her back had already cut angry red welts into her wrists. When the pond came into view, panic choked her. Her body trembled with the knowledge of what would happen underneath its putrid-looking film. The villagers had wasted no time in making sure the ducking stool was already in place. It was a rough-hewn chair that had been fastened to a beam about 12 feet long, which protruded like a giant's arm from the bank of the pond. She could already imagine the beam splashing down into the stagnant water. My mother and sister both died in that chair, she thought. plain and unadorned as it was, the thing was stained all over with death and suffering. She could even taste it in her mouth. A ring of villagers stood around the pond, watching her. Some of the women picked nervously at the hems of their rough-spun dresses, while others rubbed crucifixes and Bibles for reassurance. Most of their faces were sour with scorn, fear, and the triumph that arises from knowing that something sinful is about to be dealt with. A wicked triumph, when it can justify taking the lives of my mother and my sister, she thought bitterly. It was hard to imagine that. Only a few weeks before, their kitchen had bustled with warmth and activity. Her mother had been busy tending to a stew on the stove, humming an old hymn, and Angelica had picked at bunches of herbs that hung above the fireplace. Her sister had played underneath their table, running her hands along the edge of the plain, rough tablecloth, pretending it was a horse's mane. According to the customs of their small, God-fearing hamlet, she should have been studying the Bible instead of playing, but she was barely 7, and their mother had always been indulgent. Too indulgent for her own good, she thought, as tears pricked at her eyes. It hadn't taken long for other villagers to come forth and bleat rumours about her and her family, from how they used their herbs to create potions that made babies sick, to how they danced in a circle under a full moon. Now she was haunted by the sight of her little sister's face, slack and lifeless, a strand of her wet, bright red hair still plastered across her mud-splashed cheek. Bile rose in her at the image, and even though her stomach was empty, Angelica fell to her knees and heaved. "Get up," hissed a voice behind her, and one of the village men seized her beneath her armpits and dragged her up. She faintly recognized his voice. It may have been the butcher. She struggled against the pinch of his broad hands, but she was too exhausted to fight for long. Their brief tussle earned her nothing but the pursing of lips and the narrowing of eyes from the other villagers and the ripping of her collar. She flinched as the fabric flapped and a chill, crisp wind fluttered on the exposed skin of her neck. "Look," called a voice from the crowd by the pool. "The devil himself has touched her." Angelica glanced at her shoulder and vaguely registered the sight of 2 small black holes near her clavicle. Puncture marks. The eyes of her accusers darted fearfully from her throat to the thick black splashes on her dress. No, she longed to say, it wasn't the devil. It was the strange child who did this to me. But where was she now? Now when she needed her the most? It seemed as though she was just a hallucination, after all. A tear rolled down her cheek and stung in the wind. The butcher dragged her to the pond and pushed her into the chair, tying her feet together. She squirmed and wriggled, but the rope was lashed around her ankles in the space of a minute. The seat itself was uneven, and splinters dug into her thighs. Once he was satisfied she was securely tied to the chair, the butcher stood back to admire his work, brushing his hands. A man close by recited words. "You are to endure the punishment of floating for the crime of witchcraft. If you float, you are a witch, and the water has rejected your sinful nature. If you drown, then your soul is innocent." She recognized the sound of his voice instantly and knew it was Joshua Hartnell. Joshua Hartnell had been appointed their chief magistrate and was a descendant of the village's founding father. A stern, authoritarian man from the roots of his carefully brushed hair to the tips of his calloused brown fingers. It had been he who had noticed the small, liver-coloured mole on her hand just below her thumb. "It is her witch's mark, a teat for the devil," he had cried triumphantly, and with that, her fate had been sealed. He smelt to her like power and greed and she hated that her once peaceful little hamlet had been named after his ancestors. It was Joshua Hartnell who had been first to mention his fear of her wicked desires at the trial. The question was, how had he known? She forced herself to look at him, and on seeing his impassive face, felt a strange urge to bare her teeth at him. I will have my vengeance on you, and all your kindred, she vowed. And may the Lord have mercy on your soul, finished the priest, crossing himself nervously. One of the villagers, the blacksmith's wife, who had known her mother since childhood, pointed at her. Witch, she spat, and her shrew-like angular face twisted in hate. Slowly, the lever of the ducking stool was put into motion, and the beam began to rise above the bank. Angelica's feet, small and bare, dangled in the empty space. Some people below cheered. The wind felt harsh against her skin, but she kept her face impassive and tried not to show how frightened she was. Her body betrayed her though, shuddering and trembling from her fingers to her toes, as if it knew that these were her last few moments and wanted to move while it still could. A couple of toads hopped about the pond's rim, staring intently up at her. For a second, she could have sworn that one of them looked at her with its bulbous, deep black eyes and winked. The beam plummeted down, slicing through the air. Just before she hit the water, she caught a glimpse of her own reflection in the pond and saw a sallow, gaunt girl staring back at her. Her blonde hair, once thick and wavy, had escaped in clumps from her cloth cap and hung in greasy threads around her haggard face. The most terrifying thing, however, was that her eyes were no longer brown, but pitch black. As she hit the water, a scream pealed around the village, stirring the cool, dead air. Some of the witnesses shrieked and started back like frightened rabbits when pond water splashed upon their starchy clothes. Foul-tasting water rushed into her mouth and up her nose. Angelica could feel her long hair billow over her face, swept into motion by the water. She tried to kick against the chair, but the butcher had been too thorough, and the knots just rubbed at her ankles. Her cloth cap came away from her hair and drifted down to the pond bed like a bloated white fish. Tongues of fire, harsh, red, greedy, licked her lungs as she struggled to breathe. Angelica could feel her heartbeats drum beneath her skin in waves, beneath muscle and sinew and bone that breathed in agony. Breathe, she told herself, breathe, but she couldn't, not here. This was a place where there was no air, no hope, and no beauty, only darkness and decay. Angelica felt the beam judder into motion once more, and she was lifted up so that only her head and shoulders were above the water. She gulped down fresh air, black pond water trickling from her open mouth, running in rivulets from her lips to her chin. Her hair, free from its cap, now stuck to her face like fronds of seaweed and collected in the nape of her neck. She looked like a mermaid, caught and exhibited as curiosity. Joshua Hartnell crouched and squinted closely at her face. She opened one bleary eye and looked right at him. The witch is still alive. He sounded disappointed. Lower her again. Again, repeated a few of the villagers, and some of them clapped. Angelica heard the screech of the lever, and then felt coolness as the water opened its maw over her head. This time, the water engulfed Angelica completely. It held her to its cool, fetid bosom like a crying child, and would not let her go. She could almost hear it sigh happily as the ducking stool finally halted. It pressed her on every side, combing through her hair, stroking at her face. The sound of its churning was like a cooing endearment spoke in a strange foreign language. Angelica could almost hear the strange child's voice, whispering above the sighing of the water. "Trust me, I can help you." But that had been a hollow promise, and a cruel one at that. No, Angelica thought, she does not exist. I have been tricked by my own mind, and now no one can free me from this snare. My last hope has forsaken me. With an effort, Angelica lifted her head up and exhaled her very last breath. A few air bubbles, delicate as seed pearls, floated to the surface and broke one by one. A toad croaked. When the crowd was satisfied that the witch was not going to resurface, they left underneath a cloud of mutterings, heading back to their homes and their Bibles. Their plain wool clothes blended easily with the earthy smudges of bracken, undergrowth and moonlit trees around them, until only the butcher and Joshua Hartnell remained. Hartnell slid forward and pressed a gold coin into the butcher's large, outstretched palm. "Bury her with the other hags," he muttered. The butcher nodded and watched the magistrate scuttle back towards the town. Only when he was certain that he had been left alone did he place the coin safely into his pocket. With some elbow grease, the lever screeched up, and Angelica gradually rose out of the pond, water streaming from her hair, toes, and limp wrists. She sagged, lifeless, against the ropes restraining her, and a dirty grey pallor had settled over her cheeks. She was dead. Rolling his sleeves above his elbows, the butcher cut the ropes and jumped back in disgust as Angelica's corpse promptly fell upon his boots. He heaved the body up by the shoulders and dumped it on the ground. Unexpectedly, his knees swayed and he collapsed drunkenly by the water's edge, taken by surprise at his own body's weakness. He scrabbled at his throat and wheezed for breath. His face flushed a blotchy purplish blue, and then he lay still. A slight, dark-eyed, bushy-browed child stepped out from behind a silver birch and darted like a squirrel to the corpse's side. She glowered at the butcher's body, her disgust summed up in her pout and the deep slant of her brows. She tugged up her sleeve and pushed her tiny fingers into his mouth, rooting around for some unseen object. After a few minutes, she pulled out the butcher's gold coin from where it had lodged inexplicably in his throat. She gave a satisfied smile, tutted at the corpse, and hid it within the folds of her heavy dress. Settling on the ground, the child wiped her hand clean on the grass and spread her skirt around her. After a while, she reached over and smoothed a strand of Angelica's hair. She gently touched each of the dead girl's eyelashes, feeling them spring back at her touch, and stroked the cushion of her bottom lip. Her skin was cold and clammy. Bending over, the child gently brushed Angelica's lips with her own. She waited and waited and waited. Angelica's eyes flew open, and she gave a ragged, painful gasp as air filled her lungs once more. Barely noticing the child by her side, she sat on her haunches and spluttered and coughed until her stomach was free of water. She even spat out a live water beetle that had somehow crept into her mouth. It glared at her, twitching its antennae in outrage at its ungracious exit. "You took your time about it," the child said tartly. Angelica wiped the back of her mouth with a shaky hand and looked up at the child, her own eyes a mixture of fear and fury. "Who are you?" she cried hoarsely. "What have you done to me?" "I've given you your life back," the child replied patiently, neatening the hem of her skirt. "I told you it would be different, but do not fear. You can trust me. I'll help you. Angelica thought for a few moments. She felt lightheaded and very, very thirsty. So, I'm not dead? Not at all. Then this isn't the afterlife? Of course not. The little girl laughed at the thought, rocking back and forth and clapping her hands gleefully. Angelica felt her own hands, forearms, and the sides of her face. Everything felt normal, apart from her suddenly ravenous thirst. She glanced thoughtfully at the child, who immediately stopped laughing. Then you really did save me, she said quietly. Thank you. The child looked sincere. Couldn't let you die. You are the only friend I have left, Angelica said, thinking of her mother, her sister, and the angry villagers. Will you stay with me? I shall not leave you. That I promise. I'm thirsty, Angelica admitted, rubbing her throat. Ah, there's something you must do about that, the child said. She picked up the water beetle between her thumb and forefinger, coolly regarded its madly whirring legs, and then crushed it. What must I do? The child's gaze moved towards the plumes of chimney smoke wafting from the village behind them. Her lips curved in a half smile. Feed, she replied.
So, departing a little bit from some of the fantasies you can